Doc Searls.
So I changed this right up to the last minute or second based on what everybody else is doing here. This identity will get you to many other things about me. I think what we're trying to do is actually getting toward fully realizing.
Wait, sorry.
Whoop. I am not being recorded.
Are you sure? Yes.
It's all under control. The internet is on top of this. We brought the internet here as our first guest. But the internet that Vint designed, the internet that is implicit in TCP/IP, I think is the most profound thing in the history of our species. It puts us in a position to do so many good things, and yet we're sort of screwing it up. And here's the thing. So every time we live in New York. Vint isn't screwing it up. Vint's trying to unscrew. He's like the guy going around trying to unscrew everything everywhere he goes. Anyway, we live in New York, at least part-time, and we ride subways a lot. And I play a game on the subway called Rectangle Bingo. And that's where I look on the subway and I want to see how many people are jacked into their rectangle. This is a rectangle. Everybody carries a rectangle with them next to their heart or their crotch or in another personal place, like their purse or something. And sure enough, here's one time I caught bingo. I used my own rectangle, this one right here, to record everybody on the freaking subway car is jacked in. These are not the same people they were a few years ago. As a matter of fact, this is taken in March or April, and this would not have been possible if New York hadn't filled the subways with hotspots, essentially. It's not Wi-Fi, but it does Wi-Fi, and also all the four major carriers are now in all the subway stations in New York. And they're not, I mean, I could stand there, I could do any kind of crazy thing, and they're all just looking at their rectangles. So Marshall McLuhan is famous for saying many famous things, but here's two of them. One is we shape our tools, and then they shape us. And then from his book, The Medium is the Massage, meaning that his working is over. Sometimes all media work is over completely. And I wondered, how we do that. And actually, he and his son Eric co-wrote a book called Laws of Media: The New Science that gives us a heuristic, gives us an approach to this, which is what you do is you take any new medium. It could be the light bulb, it could be a camera, it could be anything, and you look at what it enhances, what it obsolesces, what it retrieves, and what, when it becomes ubiquitous, it reverses into. And so I want to look at that in terms of my own experience as a journalist. So, like many journalists, haven't been fully employed for a long time. So, the internet gave me the ability, and the web gave me the ability to write for myself. I could publish I came up with a blog. I had this blog starting in 1999. Thank you, Dave Weiner, for inventing the software I used for this. And RSS, really simple syndication. Gave me 20,000 subscribers. These people read me every day. I had like 20 to 50,000 readers every single day. And that's why I published every day. These are all links to days. And then this happened. Okay, so, and I found this cartoon this morning, Evolution of Communications. Twitter comes along, 140 characters, what more is there to say? Well, the whole freaking world goes to Twitter and to Facebook, and what's left of blogging, right? I'm blogging away. I'm still blogging away. Here's my blog. I mean, here's what I'm doing on Twitter. I jumped on it in 2007. I have a cloud score of 81, which is enviable. I have 24.1K followers, but it says here, you've made 25,000 and change impressions in the last 24 hours. You know what? A parking space makes impressions, but how many cars does it engage, right? I mean, who's impressed? The marketers talk about impressions, make an impression. You're an impressive person. It's bullshit. So we go back to my blog here, and these are the stats on my blog that's now hosted by Harvard. Best ever, 10,000 something. All time, 249,000. Yesterday, I got 400 or something yesterday, which is a lot for a blogger, but it's not like the large amount that I used to have. So, and in fact, it's so hard to publish on the blog that I put it also in Medium. Here are the stats in Medium, also not great. So I look at what happened with social media. What happened with social media? So what did it enhance? Well, it definitely enhanced conviviality. And because suddenly you're friends with high school people you haven't seen in 50 years, and probably don't want to see, but they're now in your list of far more friends that are like a multiple of your Dunbar number. Journalism, clearly, it wasn't just blogging that got obsolesced. All of journalism got obsolesced. Everybody who's on Facebook is a journalist now. Well, that's part of the dream, right? But you're doing it inside of Facebook. It retrieved gossip. If you've ever read Yuval Noah Harari's book Species, he talks about how the history of human civilization was based to a large degree on gossip. And I think it's a good guess. We certainly did. But it reversed into tribalism.
What does that mean?
What?
Versus tribalism, what does that mean?
What that means is go to something called the red-blue feed on the Wall Street Journal red-blue feed, and it has a typical liberal and a typical conservative in the U.S. and what they're being fed in their Facebook, on their Facebook pages. And what it's done is it's amplified something called homophily, which is their tendency to group with people who share like opinions or like interests.
I see.
So that's the tribalism that was suddenly it's that kind of tribalism. It's like those people all agree with me. And I know in my own extended family there are people I can't talk to about politics now. I could before. I could when I grew up with them. So actually it skipped past a bunch of other stuff I had in there, but that's just as well. So this is because we want time to talk, and I just made it go dark. That's interesting. That's almost indicative of something. So what does the internet do? What does the internet itself do? Now, what McLuhan makes this interesting distinction between what he calls figure and ground. We're always, in a Gestalt sense, we're always paying attention to the figure, and we're sort of missing what the ground is. And I think what the internet did is it gave us a new ground. Print gave us a new ground. That's why we're still talking about text. It's a heroic thing, what Freud is doing here, because text is totally important to us as a species. And it's never going to stop being important. Now, one of the things that McLuhan says is that it's important in different ways to people who write pictographically and people who write alphanumerically, but it's totally important. We're not going to make that go away. But the internet is one of those things where it's sort of like the old joke test question, describe the universe and give 3 examples, right? You can't. There's only one example of it. It is this place where we live, and it has this capacity to put us all within 0 distance of each other. This is new to human experience, and regardless of how much the phone companies or giant companies or anything else screw up our understanding of the internet, we're not going to put that genie back in the bottle. We all have the experience of being 0 distance apart at no cost, because thank God Vint did not put billing into this, okay? If it was left up to the phone companies, it would have started with billing and then done the rest, right? But they didn't, and we have something that puts us all 0 distance apart. What does that enhance, obsolesce, retrieve, and reverse into? So that's sort of what I'd like to leave you with, is it?
Thank you.
Thank you. Questions?
So, Doc, what do you see coming next? I mean, trends are important, and so we hope to hear your perspective on what's happening. What's going wrong? What can we do to make it better?
I think the pendulum is swinging from the centralized to the distributed. I think we're seeing it that's the biggest thing. But for those in the back, Vint was asking what is next? Where are we going now? I think there are lots of pendulum swings go between centralized and distributed. Brian Bellendorf is one of the inventors of Apache, talks about how we need minimum viable centralization. We're going to have some things that need to be centralized, but too many things are centralized now. Social media is too centralized, but I think with blockchain, with Bitcoin and Ethereum and all that stuff, there's one example of decentralization right now. What Joyce and I have been working on for the last 20, 25 years, but especially since I started Project VRM at the Berkman Center at Harvard, is on equipping individuals with tools that make them both independent and better able to engage. And we just encourage that. I'm not a developer myself, but we encourage that. We have a nonprofit called Customer Commons, the purpose of which is to restore the balance of power in markets between customers and companies. giving individual scale. We will solve so many business problems if each of us, for example, can change our email address one time with everybody we deal with. That's not even thinkable in a world where you're always agreeing to terms and conditions provided. So I think we're moving toward a distributed world again, very unevenly, but it's happening. Others?
There's got to be more.
Or am I going to set the record for being short on this thing? Yes.
So, just what you were explaining, it made me realize what we discussed over lunch. It's not text really, it's symbols.
It's
So
symbols?
It's symbols. The computer is a symbol processing engine. We are symbol processing engines.
Right.
As somebody would say, we are information processing information ourselves.
Yeah.
So really, yeah.
So one of my favorite philosophers and scientists is a guy named Michael Polanyi, who is Hungarian. And you'll be the one guy in the room who knows who he is.
Yes.
Who spoke the, there's two. So, I mean, what he said was science is always concerned with the explicit, but our knowledge is tacit. We always know more than we can tell. There's a reason we don't remember how we started the sentences we're ending, or will end the sentences we start, but somehow we convey meaning anyway. And that meaning is tacit inherently. And that tacit dimension is what we're always trying to get at with text and with symbols and the rest of it. So,
yes. But if you want to understand them, we understood, you need these symbols.
yeah. Agreed. Anybody else? Did I stun you into silence? Yeah.
In this process of enhancing and retrieving, is
Wait,
there
I'm sorry, I'm
space,
gonna have to come closer.
in this process that you talk about, is there space for individual will or directing the process?
In the space that I'm sorry?
Enhancing, retrieving.
Oh, I think there always is. I mean, it's, obviously, we're human beings, we're always involved. These are not forces beyond us, these are things we adopt and changes. And, so yeah, I mean, there's not only room for the individual, I think the individual's key. So, I mean, but I'm biased. I mean, the world I'm working toward, and I've been working toward for some time, is one where lots of problems get solved because, not just because we're working for ourselves in some libertarian sense, but rather that we're fully equipped to engage, so and there are inventions right now where any one of, and they're not being fully developed, but they're on the way, where any individual can have a conduit between themselves and any entity they relate with. So for example, you buy a pair of shoes, you can give this pair of shoes its own cloud. It doesn't have to have electronics in it. It's now in the Internet of your things. And if you have an experience with those shoes, you can share it with the company that made it. It's good for them, it's good for you, they can send you information on it, but it's your tool. And I think that changed. I mean, I'm trying to work all four of those to change business right now. And so that's probably not a good enough answer. I'm feeling time.
Yeah, just as a quick note, for any of you who is interested in McLuhan because you know a lot about him or because you don't, his grandson is a McLuhan scholar of the highest order, and he's just a phenomenal person. And he is working on putting together something new and interesting that I will announce when he lets me.
Which grandson, sorry?
Yeah.
Andrew. Yeah, I know. We know him.
Just fantastic. Yeah. So
Yeah.
great. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you. Let me yank the chip out before I forget it.
Oh yeah, that's on this. Mark Bernstein.
I study hypertexts, links among lexia and connections between concepts. New media, by which I chiefly mean hypertext, lets us write more densely than ever. The link is the most important textual innovation, of course, since the comma. What is text? This is text. We could call it transdilbene using letters, but no one, not even many chemists, would understand transdilbene, where lots of people understand this. Text is indispensable. We have no better way to talk about chemistry, physics, law, mathematics, engineering, all sorts of things than text. This is text. Well, a bit of it is music written down, but the rest is labo notation for dance. All sorts of things are text. Kids today, we know, have no attention span. No one can be bothered reading blogs, for example, though I too still write one. But all the kids today have read this million-word novel somehow. And lots of them routinely watch 100-hour movies like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. It wasn't that long ago when Andy Warhol made headlines and magazine covers with an 8-hour movie. For 25 years now, I've been asking, where are the hypertexts? Our new media world is in bad shape, but our software world is in bad shape too. We live in the world of the 99-cent app, a world in which no one can write software, where people in high school literally ask, can they find a career path in which they can support themselves writing software, any kind of software? Don Norman and Jakob Nielsen have taught the world that software ought to be easy, intuitive, effortless, appliance-like. But software cannot be that way. Our software ecosphere is neurotic, literally. It cannot be what they say it must be. We cannot play this tune beyond us yet ourselves, a tune upon the blue guitar of things exactly what they are. And the results of not being able to do this are all too clear. There's a lot of fuzzy thinking everywhere about modernism and postmodernism. It's a marsh in particular that engineers and scientists prefer to avoid. There are good tribal and professional reasons for doing this. There are also some good intellectual reasons for staying out of this marsh if we could, but we can't anymore. We can't avoid it. I don't think we should even try, even though we know it's a marsh and our feet are going to get wet. A long time ago, the Enlightenment determined to face things exactly as they are. And in the 19th century, this became progressively elaborated as we understood that things aren't often what they seem. Things are complicated and multivalent. We need to see things through time and through space and through many angles at once, and we are ill-equipped to do this. We end up in a world of Heisenberg and Gödel and the Western Front, and it's uncomfortable, but it is the way things are. Modernism had a good long run. Arguably, it ends in 1967. Like capitalism, it is and always was crammed with contradictions and prone to problematization. 50 years ago, the sensual directness of hot medium offered hope of a way out of the perils of modernism. That lasted about a year. From Paris to Prague, Bobby and Martin, the dream died hard and fast. In the arts, and especially in academe, postmodernism kept it propped up for a while, but we understand at last its limitations, even as the Trumpists have at length discovered the utility of its moves. Hamlet in the Holodeck is 20 years old this year. We've tried to live up to its fever dream, but digital environments aren't any of the things that Janet Murray says they are and that we've been saying they are for all these years. Digital environments approach asymptotically to anything. That's the nature of the digital and nothing else is, and we know this. Digital approximates, that's what it is. Art approximates too. Approximation introduces distortion. We know this, we always have. It's the blue guitar, it changes everything. But it only works when we're trying as readers, and it only works when we're trying as writers. That's why Millard and Hargood's Hypertext 17 paper is really, really important. It doesn't matter whether the tale is objectively good. No story is objectively good. It doesn't matter if it's well received. Nothing I tell you as a publisher, nothing is well received. Certainly, my hypertext, Those Trojan Girls, wasn't well received, but that doesn't matter. The experience matters, and in fact, there are ideas here that can matter in instructing people at least what not to do. I tried to write down some of them in book form. This statue is a story about cholera and tuberculosis, but it's also a story about stories. It's a story of a girl resisting change. She's going to fail, but she's also going to succeed because she's stone, and she has nothing to fear because she doesn't exist. Here's another story. This is also a text. It's 1437. We don't need a lot of explication. A young woman receives some unexpected news. Same story differently. There's a lot of story here, not least the conflict between this scene, Fra Angelico. There's an important change in Mary's class, in her ethnicity. The angel has changed a bit. This is a study. Again, it's in dialogue both with what came after and what came before. And here we have the story again. Sun, light bulb, cell phone, and Mary, everything in alignment. The messenger again has changed a bit. The Puritan mistakes pleasure for frivolity because he mistakes seriousness for solemnity. We have a real problem with this confusion. In the white box especially, we're terribly interested in decay, in forgetting betrayal and death, and we're very, very fucking serious. In the game world, we're terribly interested in immersion and flow, identification and box office. But it seems we're always telling a story about the same power fantasy, and that princess is always in another castle. With Oscar Wilde, we go to dinner, and the bankers talk only about art, and the artists only talk about money. I've been writing this year a review of tabletop role-playing games and automata for authors. They are full of things like this 1936 table of unusual female occupations. The usual female occupations table is equally long, but very, very depressing. This leads in this generation to some extremely interesting work beyond Puritanism. The enemy of density is not giving it down. Seriousness sometimes helps. Here's Night Witches, a story of a Soviet night bomber regiment staffed entirely by women flying outdated biplanes against invading Germans by night, outwitting the army bureaucracy by day, and their search for forbidden love and maybe spare parts. Most of my work right now involves Tinderbox, a knowledge representation tool for everyone's everyday knowledge work. It's a spatial hypertext tool with inheritance composites, flexible attributes, value store, and lots of little agents that organize the document yourself. Mostly we pretend it's simply to save typing, and this is a problem, that we can't actually talk about what the software wants to be because people are scared of software. There's a lot to do. We live in a world, or we work in a field, where nice papers and dissertations are hanging from trees and rotting for lack of anyone to pick them. We need to read hypertexts. If you don't know, Punch Drunk, world's best hyper drama company, they know more about hypertext than we do, is staging a new production with London as its stage, running from late October through early November. You need to get a lottery and a friend to see it. You should. Write hypertexts. Doesn't have to be any good. Just do it. You no longer have to build your own system. And saying one thing is not only very difficult, it's unnecessary and, in fact, impossible. So if you try to have one lexia mean exactly one thing, you are going to be doomed to frustration. There's a lot to do, but we have to do it in multiple ways. Thank you.
Batteries go.
Oh, okay. That's fine, we have the other one. Questions? Not you, Edgar.
I don't have a question, just an observation. Punch Drunk is fantastic, but there's a similar experience called Alice Underground in London. Sorry?
You have to bellow at me, I'm sorry.
Sorry, yeah, I haven't got a question. It's just only 864 people can see Punch Drunk because there's only 2 members of the audience. But I went to see, what's it called?
Alice in the Vaults.
Alice in the Vaults, and it's absolutely fantastic. And runs every hour, and it's similar. I do it because I write hypertext and play hypertext, and you're absolutely right. It was a hypertext, individualised experience. It was fantastic, so I recommend it highly. And if you get Punch Drunk, do, but
Yeah,
lottery.
there's also Sleep No More in Shanghai and New York, both places where people occasionally do go.
Bouncing off that, Mark, you say there's lots to do, and one of those things is write hypertexts. But as that exchange just identified, there are hypertexts, but people aren't reading them. Well, no, sorry. Not necessarily. It's there's the issue here of trying to bring this form from being esoterica into means. That's a real challenge. I don't know what's
To be fair, Victory Lap, in addition to Punch Drunk, you've got Arcadia from Faber and Faber. Ian Pears is not a minor name in contemporary literature. We've got Seed by, help me, there are increasingly hypertexts. There's also the interactive fiction people claim vast readership, if not revenues, and scorn us for not reading their stuff. We scorn them for not reading our stuff. And there is plenty to read, but reading, supplying us with hypertext to study used to be the problem. Now I'm saying that actually the act of writing, actually allowing yourself to write a hypertext is a desirable thing regardless of audience.
It's not about finding the text, it's about experiencing the writing.
One quick question left.
I hit something, I need to log in again, so.
Oh, okay.
Didn't do it. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Yeah, like I said, because I used to say it. Keith Houston.
Hi everyone. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, great. Rather than talk about the future of text, because I didn't have my talk ready in time, I'm going to talk about the past. I'm going to talk about the birth of writing and of the book. I'm going to talk about dead trees and linearity, because I think the way that text is transmitted is at least as important as the text itself. So, let's start here. Let's start in Mesopotamia, about 3700 BC. On the left, what we have are a series of counting tokens. These were used to represent agricultural transactions. One token might mean 1 ear of, whatever barley, whatever grain it is you're interested in. And some of them were incised with symbols that represented the commodity that was being exchanged. So at some point, farmers started enclosing tokens inside these clay balls. They acted as envelopes, and what this did was it made the transaction permanent. Of course, this is a pain. Once you've exchanged this ball, you then need to crack it open again to see what was inside it. So later, about 3200 BC or so, someone worked out that, well, we have these little symbols on the tokens. If we press the tokens into the surface of the ball before we seal the tokens inside, we don't actually need to look inside. And of course, the tokens become irrelevant, and the symbols become the important thing. So this, not quickly, but this becomes cuneiform by about 3000 BCE or so. And the Egyptians catch on pretty quickly. They go from zero to writing system in a few hundred years. So cuneiform took millennia, really, to evolve from these clay balls and tokens into a fully fledged writing system. And hieroglyphics, papyrus, just sort of comes out of nowhere. In fact, the Egyptians thought, this is literally miraculous, we've done a really cool thing here, and they gave credit to the god Thoth. But there was an Egyptian king, Thaumas, a mythical king, who received the gift of writing from Thoth. And he wasn't really into it. He said, this invention will produce forgetfulness in the minds of those who learn to use it, because they will not practice their memory. Their trust in writing, produced by external characters which are no part of themselves, will discourage the use of their own memory within them. So, I mean, that's pretty familiar, right? You can say the same about the internet. Oh, God, it's going to ruin us. We'll all be unable to remember anything. So I think, arguably, the most important thing the Egyptians did was not necessarily hieroglyphics. After all, we already had writing, we already had syllabic, ideographic writing. What they did was they came up with a new writing material, papyrus, made of this stuff, papyrus reeds. They made everything else with it too. They made boats and sandals and ropes. They ate it, they burned it to cook with. And so it's also natural that they would use this to make something to write on. This is what they made. This is a sheet of papyrus that I bought on the internet. Thank you, Vid. This is also a thing you can do. You can buy papyrus on the internet. But really, what we have now is kind of, it's guesswork. No one wrote convincingly about how papyrus was made. Well, no one has ever in the ancient world written convincingly about how papyrus was made. Pliny had a go, and he was mostly wrong. But the Egyptians made it work. They created a light, relatively smooth, relatively flexible, relatively robust writing surface that was used for millennia. It was the internet of the day. It was what everyone wrote on for literally for thousands of years. And this is what the Egyptians and the Greeks and the Romans made with papyrus. They made scrolls. They took a series of sheets and they glued them together into this long linear thing that you'd roll from one hand into the other. Of course, this is where the notion of scrolling comes from in a computing sense. And these are big things. Maybe 20 sheets was roundabout standard in Roman times, so that's about 15 feet long. This is not an easy thing to manage. The Romans actually sometimes had desks. They would wedge a wooden rod into each end of a scroll, and then to place the scroll on this desk with pegs sticking up from it so they could finally take their hands off it rather than having to use paperweights or anything. In fact, there was a Roman senator who died because papyrus was so unwieldy. He was trying to walk and read at the same time, and his papyrus, like a teenager on a smartphone, and the papyrus, or us, frankly, on our smartphones, the papyrus sprang out of his grasp onto the floor. He leaned down to pick it up, slipped on the marble, fell over, broke his hip, and died as a result. So apart from that, papyrus wasn't great. Scrolls were not. There's not a great information density in a scroll. They tended to have large margins, especially on the lower edge of the page, because they tended to fray as you rolled them back and forth across your toga. And it was almost impossible to write on both sides. If you find a scroll which has been written on both sides, it's because someone has reused an old one. There was almost no reason to do this. So papyrus, useful, light, relatively robust, but not very portable and a bit unwieldy. So the Greeks and Romans also used these. This is a diptych, or a twofold writing tablet. This harked back to cuneiform. This is just a couple of bits of wood with some beeswax in it, and you write on it with a pointy stick. It's about the simplest possible way of writing. There is a bit of it's worth pointing out, this is actually the wrong orientation. Normally, if you were Greek or Roman, you would have held them vertically, a bit like a laptop. So, when this image came to light a while back, the Daily Mail gave us the headline, "Is this ancient Greek statue proof someone took a laptop back in time?" No, Daily Mail. It's not. That's Betteridge's law of headlines. Any headline that ends in a question mark can be answered with the word no. So if let's say this is the end of the first millennium, end of the first millennium BC, start of the first millennium AD. You can choose between a scroll, which is light and flexible, but quite fragile and unwieldy, or you can choose a writing tablet, which is portable, but very, very limited in the amount of stuff you can get on it. This is what came next. Almost out of nowhere, paged books. The codex arrives, and anyone that tells you they know where this came from or why it evolved is basically lying or have made some theory up which is not yet accepted. There are fragments from as early as the first century first century AD that suggests that they come from books, as in they have writing that continues on the back side of a sheet, which just never really happened for scrolls. This one is from the 4th century. It's part of a big find called the Nag Hammadi Library, which was literally unearthed in 1945. A pair of Egyptian farmers were digging up topsoil from one field to move it into another one, and they came across a big clay jar sealed with pitch, and they didn't want to break it open in case there was a genie inside, but they worked up the courage and did so anyway, and they found this, and they found 12 leather-bound papyrus books and some loose sheets. Now, it turned out the books were sort of esoteric Christian works. They're related to Gnosticism. But the important thing is they are books. This is a fully formed paged book from the 4th century. They're the right size and shape. Books are still about this size and shape. Books are the way that they are because we are the way we are. They're easy for us to read. They have to be a certain size, they have to be a certain shape, otherwise they're rubbish as books. The next big thing, sorry I'm rushing a little bit, the next big thing to come along to not to change bookmaking, but to improve it, was the invention of parchment. So papyrus was relatively straightforward to make. You take a papyrus reed, you cut the pith into strips, you make this kind of crosswise layering of them, leave it to dry in the sun, Bob's your uncle. Parchment is not. Parchment was invented, or supposedly, in this Greek city-state called Pergamon, and Pergamon were war profiteers. There was a war going on in Egypt, which meant that papyrus exports dropped precipitously. And the Pergamenes came along and said, hey guys, we've got this new material. It was parchment, it was this stuff, made from animal skin. And it's really time consuming to make. First you need an animal, so you've got a certain amount of time to wait for your animal to get to a point at which it's worth cutting up. Then you do a bunch of unspeakable things to its corpse, and parchment comes out the other side. It's light, like papyrus. It's springy and resilient and foldable. It doesn't fray. It's really nice to write on if you're using a reed pen or a quill or a ballpoint pen, frankly. You feel like a very noble person as you write on a piece of parchment. Also from the internet, by the way. But of course, Pergamon didn't invent parchment. Leather had been used for centuries. They may have improved it. They may have come up with a process that fixes it in place rather than leaving it kind of floppy. But they got the naming rights. Parchment literally comes from Pergamena Carta or Pergamena Charta. So in Europe especially, parchment overtook papyrus for bookmaking. But something else overtook it. This is a woodcut print from a Chinese book of, I think the 17th century. But papermaking hadn't really changed. In 106 AD, a eunuch and part-time torturer called Sai Lun entered the Chinese court and said, I have invented a thing. It is this stuff, it is this paper. And he described how he'd made it. He used hemp rags, old fishing nets, and tree bark, macerated it in a trough in his garden. Then he used a kind of flat sieve made of bamboo to draw out a layer of the fibres, let it dry in the sun, peeled it off, and he'd made paper. He also did not invent it, but he had really good PR, and so he's the sort of the traditional inventor of paper, even if he didn't, even if the archaeological record says that he didn't invent it. And paper came to Europe through Muslim Spain. It was brought from China into this gigantic Islamic caliphate that lay between us and China, from there into Spain, and so it stayed in Europe after the Reconquista. It stayed in Spain, and we started to use it in Europe. But not everyone was very happy about it. There was an abbot called Peter the Venerable who said, God reads the book of Talmud in heaven, but what kind of a book? Is it the kind we have in daily use, made from the skins of rams and goats? Or is it from the rags of old cast-off undergarments, or rushes out of eastern swamps, or some other vile material? So he didn't like papyrus or paper, but the mill stayed open, and paper was cheap and widely available. Eventually we started exporting it back into the caliphate, and so these Muslim paper makers had to contend with bits of paper with Christian watermarks like unicorns and images of Christ and the Grail and so on. And it all came together into this. It all came together into the book. After paper hits the codex, the page book, it's a series of marginal gains. We start making them out of, we start making books out of multiple little folded booklets or quires or gatherings. We improve the binding, so we have this called double cord binding, which is much more robust than the earlier styles. And that's where I'm going to stop. This is a little medical book from the 15th century. It would have been recognisable as a book for about 1,000 years before then, and it would have been recognisable as a book for about 500 years after that. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Um,
Before questions, I'd just like to mention if anybody would like to know more about the history of the book, you should definitely get your book, which is called what again?
it's called The Book.
Questions? Actually, I'm not kidding. You really should get it. It's so ridiculously beautifully made.
I'm also not kidding. You should also definitely get it.
Don't get any Kindle version. It's so wonderfully made. Yes, please.
So the book is sort of a random access scroll, and
Yes.
it imposes a set of disciplines and order. For example, we have notions of page numbers, and we have chapters and titles and indexes and so on. Now we get these electronic objects that don't have the same set of constraints. So now we have problems identifying where is something. So what is it that you see as a way of saying, we don't have a page number necessarily in some of these online formats. What is the correct reference to use now to point people to a place in a text?
That's a really good question. I mean, I know that Kindle books have locations which are fixed within the text. So you can say, see location 5222.
Yeah, but if you change the font, you change the...
Well, no, these are fixed. These are located within the text.
Okay.
So there are fixed points of reference. But I think
okay.
as much as anything else, it's not just about the fact that the book has page numbers. It's about the fact that it has physical heft, that you know to start at the beginning or the end or the middle.
Right.
Where was I roughly? And this is the thing that ebooks lack. There's this lack of tactility means it's really hard to work out where was I. Was I quarter of the way through? Was I 75% of the way through? I don't know. It's a good question.
And a hypertext thing is even more ungainly in that respect.
Ungainly and weirdly, I think in some cases, freakish to think about because it doesn't exist. If it's a temporary arrangement of something, wait, what is the correct order? That is the thing. I'm interested. It's really interesting to listen to all these talks because even though I come from a software background, I'm used to writing nice, long, linear things, and the idea of a constantly shifting sands of hypertext weirds me out a little bit. Anyway, sorry.
So we quite often hear about how we've been kind of constrained by the page,
Mm.
the codex and so on. So there probably is something very interesting to be learned from looking at how people wrote in, for example, a scroll, which have a very different set of affordances, even as much as where you would start or where the ability to store a finishing point, to have a scalable viewing window, continuous writing. I'm thinking of kind of Scott McCloud's work on comics, for example, exploring those kind of ideas with digital comics. Has work been done looking at how those affordances affected the way that people express themselves when they were working with scrolls rather than a codex?
Probably. I'm not not an academic, so I can't give you a decent answer. I think the thing that I started out writing about punctuation, and there was none. Initially, in the very early days, there were no word spaces. There's no punctuation at all. The concept of a paragraph is pretty loose. You just have a mark in the margin saying there's something interesting on this line. It might be a paragraph break, it might be something else. So initially, at least, there were no affordances, and you started at the beginning, you damn well read to the end, and you as the reader had to work out what the interesting parts were. And when punctuation came along, it was a tool for the reader, not a tool for the writer to make sense of it. So yes, affordances grew up. But clearly it took a really long time for that to happen. Anyone else?
Just on a little bridge, it seems there's this thing about linear books and all the hypertext reading. Let's not forget that if you're reading for academic purposes, it's very rare you read the whole document straight through. Right? You will read many things and you would still, even though it is on paper, it has that aspect to it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.
The very well named Paul Smart.
Thanks, Troy. So I'm a senior research fellow here at the University of Southampton. It's probably worth saying at the outset that text isn't really my thing. It's not my primary area of research, which is kind of odd really, because I seem to spend most of my waking life generating text. So you'd think that I'd invest a bit more research interest into it. What I am interested in is the relationship between aspects of symbolic and cultural scaffolding and the nature of the human mind. So I'm particularly interested in issues about how the idiosyncratic aspects of human cognition emerge from the various external structures that we build around us. And in respect of that, I'm going to focus on, I'm going to share some of the thoughts that I've had in respect of the role of writing, the cognitive functions of writing. So the first thing that I want to introduce is this notion of what's been dubbed the mangrove effect. When we think of the relationship between trees and islands in the middle of an ocean, we tend to think that the island is the thing that comes first and then the tree grows on top of it. But in the case of the mangrove, you have the reverse is true. So it turns out that the seed pod for the mangrove tree has these aerial roots that establish themselves in the substrate of the ocean, and then various forms of ocean-borne debris come along and they get caught in the aerial roots, and then the island forms around the tree. And something similar, I suggest, occurs in respect of our exposure to words, to written text, or even spoken language in some respects. And the idea is that words are not just simply a reflection of our thoughts, they're not just merely a serialization of our thoughts, they're also part of the very stuff from which our thoughts emerge. So when we're exposed to words, certain words evoke other thoughts. They stimulate us to embark on cognitive trajectories that we might not otherwise have embarked on. And so we have this kind of sense of words playing this kind of role in generating new ideas, new thoughts. Just like the mangrove tree, the words are the things that sometimes come first, and then the thoughts are the things that cohere around them. Just to try and press the nautical metaphor a little bit. I'm very fond of thinking that words play the role of material anchors. So as these kind of stable symbolic structures, I think they play a very important role in disciplining the fluid, the context-sensitive, the unruly dynamics of the bare biological brain. And one way to cash this out is to think of words as a kind of like a concrete perceptible. So by encoding thoughts and ideas in a written form, you're able to present the biological brain with your thoughts in a different format. So it's almost like this kind of vision of a loop that goes out from the brain into the world, and then you're exposed to your own ideas in a different format. Those thoughts and ideas re-enter your brain via a different pathway through your sensory modalities. And in doing so, they recruit different brain systems that might not otherwise have been activated. And sometimes that helps to drive the cognitive process along. So the vision is one of having these extended circuits that are kind of like a kind of extra neural projection that goes out through the world that connects parts of the brain that might otherwise not have been connected, and certainly activates areas of the brain that might otherwise have been activated. So another idea is this idea of the stabilization of cognitive states. So the brain is a very kind of dynamic, fluid thing. It's like a stormy sea. It's very dynamic. And the virtue of words in this respect is that by encoding thoughts and ideas in a written form, you're able to revisit your own ideas at different points in time, in different cognitive and affective states, and also to reflect on ideas with respect to any experiences you've had in the intervening period. So here we have this idea of thoughts being kind of sufficiently stabilized, or stabilized for just long enough for you to revisit your own kind of mental states at different points in time. And then following on from that, as I said, the brain is this kind of very fluid, very dynamic, very turbulent kind of system. And what's interesting about this is that in some ways you can think of a word never being exposed to the same brain state twice. So just as Heraclitus said, no one ever steps into the same river twice. It's also true, I think, that we never approach words in the same kind of brain state. And this is important, I think, when it comes to issues like creativity and the way in which words are able to stimulate us to have different kinds of ideas, again, at different points in time. And then another idea is this idea of mental manipulation. So I think this is quite important. By encoding ideas in written format, you're able to represent ideas in physical space. And by virtue of the fact that your ideas then become these kind of material vehicles that you can manipulate with physical action, you can actually manipulate aspects of your mind, if you like, in a way that the bare biological brain may never have done so. So often when I'm writing and I'm trying to have new ideas, I will just physically kind of take written fragments of text and just rearrange them in space. And so by juxtaposing different ideas and thoughts in physical space, I'm then able to explore aspects of cognitive space, the cognitive terrain that I might not otherwise have been able to do. So I'm I've kind of exhausted the nautical metaphors now, so I'll move on to painting. So I tend to think of writing as a bit like painting, and there are a number of virtues, I think, of thinking it in virtues that come from thinking about it in that way. So one is this idea that writing is a cooperative exercise. So when we think of the writing machine, the thing that's actually generating the text, it's easy to think that it's just ourselves and our brain that's doing all the work. But I think there is a much better vision, is to see it as being this cooperative exercise between yourself and some external resources. So just as in the case of painting, when you're painting, the thing that emerges sometimes emerges as a result of this iterative process of dabbing paint, and then you're stimulated to have a new insight and dab some more spots of paint. The kind of painting evolves over time as a result of these iterative interactions between yourself and aspects of the external environment. And the same is very much true, I think, when it comes to writing. So very few of us, I suspect, actually write a paper by first representing the whole text in our heads and then just serializing it onto some external medium. Instead, the paper just evolves through time, and you're stimulated to have new ideas as you go along. So the idea here is essentially one of the writing machine as being one that's more than just the biological brain, that the writing machine is this kind of extended cognitive organization that incorporates aspects of the bio-external environment. And I think one of the reasons this is important is because I'm often frustrated by text-related technologies, because they often seem to embody this assumption that writing is just a process of serializing your cognitive innards into the world. It's serializing your thoughts into some external medium. Whereas actually what I really like is for the technologies to work in concert with me and to reflect this kind of iterative, dynamical process that contributes to the unfolding of text. Okay, what's the next one? A hangman's noose. Right, okay, we're nearly there. So I think one other thing to note is just, I think when we think about the future of text, it helps to look at the history of text, and in that respect, I'm very grateful to the previous speaker for saving me some time. I want to kind of specifically reflect on scriptura continua, which is this kind of archaic form of well, not that archaic actually, it was around until the 7th and 8th century. But it's this form of writing where you just omit any spaces and you just have a continuous stream of text. And the theory is that this style was used because the aim of writing was simply to record spoken speech, and spoken speech sounds like this continuous stream of words, and so that's what the writing should look like as well. And then when we consider the way in which scriptura continua evolved into more modern writing forms of practice, there's a number of issues that I think are important to bear in mind. So one is that one of the factors that led to the evolution of modern writing practices is the nature of the material artifacts, the nature of the technology. So parchment and papyrus is quite difficult and in short supply and very expensive, but then as paper becomes available, space is less of an issue, so you can introduce spaces between the words. Another aspect is culture. So our writing practices are shaped by cultural conventions and norms, and sometimes it takes a long time for us to adapt to the introduction of a new technology and to exploit that technology to its maximum cognitive potential. And then finally, there's also the function of text. And what function is text playing? In the case of Scriptura Continua, it was one of recording text. But I think there's also this, when we think about the future of text technology, we should also think about the kind of cognitive functions that it's playing and the way in which we can adapt that to suit cognitive objectives.
Thank you very much. Questions?
Your discussion of text as material anchor as a way of stabilizing cognitive states situates a lot of meaning in the text, where the trend since 1946 has been to recognize that a lot of the meaning in the discourse is not actually in the text. How do you reconcile those two?
So when I was talking about the role of text in kind of stabilizing particular ideas, I was primarily thinking in terms of the way in which we can use written artifacts in a kind of personal sense as part of a kind of personal writing exercise. But you're absolutely right, of course. There is a lot of fluidity and flexibility in terms of the way that people interpret text. And I think that's one of the virtues, that in a social context, that text is open to the vagaries of different kinds of interpretations, and I suspect in some ways that's the lifeblood of creativity. So, yes, I agree with you. But I still think that at least in a personal context, there's still something to be said for this idea that you're able to represent ideas and thoughts at a particular point in time, and that gives them at least some stability so that you can revisit them in different cognitive, affective and physiological experiential states.
One last quick question. Well, I'm copying the next presentation across.
I have a question perhaps related to that idea of creativity, which is there any kind of cognitive science work on hypertext, for example?
As we may think. As we may think.
As we may think, yeah, as we're thinking.
No, as we may think, written in 1955. There was made this so far. Was it? Yeah. Well, maybe it's one I missed, sorry, apologies, but as we may think, I'd say. Sorry, Mark.
Yeah, so, well, yes, there has... There has been a lot of work, not all of it favourable to the idea that the internet is always benefiting us in a cognitive sense. I think those ideas have to be interpreted more in a social context than an individual one. So there is some evidence that at least certain forms of hypertext might be seen to undermine the cognitive profile of individuals, but the evidence for that is somewhat weak. And I think when you look at things in a more social context and you think of the cognitive virtues of hypertext in a more kind of sociological, from a more socio-ecological perspective, then you have a much more positive perspective of the cognitive functions, cognitive role of hypertext.
Thank you very, very much. Sorry, did you have a USB?
No.
Okay. Pip Willcox.
Thanks,
I will do magic.
Oh, you will indeed. Thank you. Thank you, Freud. And thanks, everyone. This is a fantastic conversation.
You have to point out that you stepped in
do
at
not
quite literally the last second.
Yes, with apologies for those of you who are hoping for something more interesting. I don't work for the Ministry of Defence in France. Yet. Who knows by the end of today. This is another talk about the process of textual transmission and reception. My own background is number 40 on Mark's Unusual Jobs for Women. I'm an editor, or at least I used to be before I did what I do now. And for me, text is profoundly social. Its construction is profoundly social, and I'm fascinated by how many of these talks have started with, and in some cases continued with, biography, or at least perhaps a prosopography of our work. This is not going to be about me, but I thought it important to say I used to be an editor. And this is where I started. This was my first research job, was on a project that worked on the Canterbury Tales. This is one of the many copies of it that I own. This is beautiful. It's large format. It's hardback. It's illustrated, as it says. And it makes me look very clever on my coffee table. But this is a lie. This is not the text. This is the text. This, as you see, comes between the end of the prologue and the beginning of the first part. And in this beautifully illustrated medieval manuscript. And it was from this that book was created, although of course it wasn't, because this is actually what it was created from, an assembly of manuscripts. And again, this is not true. This was from a Google search done at something like midnight last night. Thank you, Freud.
You're welcome.
This says more perhaps about Google. This is what happens when you put into Google image search Canterbury Tales manuscript. And in saying that it says more about Google, of course, what it actually says is it's saying more about us. What we want is pretty manuscripts with lots of pictures that have something to do with Chaucer or the Canterbury Tales. And in fact, most of the manuscripts that survive to us of the Canterbury Tales are not illustrated. They're not beautiful. Some of them are barely legible. These are not delightful, sort of high-class things that you would be proud to put on your coffee table. That's not the impression that you'd get from Google. So for those of us who were sleeping through our literature classes, Chaucer was a part-time writer. He was known in his lifetime and loved for his writing. A gallon of wine daily for the rest of his life, as remuneration such as I don't get from my university, and wrote the Canterbury Tales towards the end of the 14th century. And the premise of the story is 29 pilgrims meet in Southwark, and they're going on pilgrimage to Canterbury, hence the Canterbury Tales, and they all agree to tell 2 tales each. One wonderful theme of almost all the research I do is it seems to be into people who don't finish their projects. So we're expecting 116 stories, yeah, and perhaps a prologue and perhaps a conclusion. And amongst the pilgrims is this complete idiot called Geoffrey Chaucer. It's a wonderful poem. There is no authorial version. We have nothing in his handwriting. There are 83 partial or complete-ish manuscripts before 1500. That includes 4 print versions as well, which get sort of lumped in with the manuscripts. There are 24 of the 116 expected tales, about 17,000 lines of literature. So why do we bother with this at all? I would suggest because it's brilliant and funny and tells us a lot about the human condition. But the reason that people are interested in all these different versions of the tales are, amongst many other things, all the very many different variants, the differences between these manuscripts. And some of them are fascinating if you're interested in the differences in dialect in different forms of Middle English, medieval English. And some of them are because the scribes who copied them fell asleep and copied the same line twice, or missed out a chunk due to eye skip, or in the case of one in particular, thought he could do better than Chaucer and amends lots of it. Alexander Pope did the same to Shakespeare. There's a long tradition of thinking, yes, quite good, let me improve on that for you. And so we have many, many different editions of the Canterbury Tales. But what we didn't have was an overview of what all the manuscripts said. The same ones kept being copied again and again, and often they were the most beautiful, the most impressive physically. So in the 1920s, Manley and Rickert decided to do what they thought would take a few years, and actually took 16, was to go through all of the extant manuscripts and make an edition which was not meant for a beautiful coffee table, but lists all the substantive variants and the less substantive variants between them. One of them died doing it, but the main reason of telling you this story is to show you this picture. This is hypertext. This is Edith Manley sewing. this is sewing links. This is physically manifesting the links between the tails. They did finish the edition. Here's one copy of it. I've got another one on my shelf at home. So it's this social approach to editions, the long conversation that goes on between editors across the centuries, and between scribes before that as they copied each other's work, was what drew me to conversations with my friends in the e-research centre, hello, who were part of the Social Machines project that I know was based here at Southampton. I think I get prize for being the first person to say social machine in today. Yay! This will be familiar to many of you. Tim Berners-Lee on social machines. So one of the very few contributions that I think I made to the project was explaining what an edition is. My colleagues in the e-research centre thought that an edition, bang, here's Shakespeare, here's Chaucer, is a finished thing. Whereas for me, it's here's our best attempt, according to my view and the things that I've read about what we think the text is currently, and I fully expect it to be changed in the next time someone makes an edition of this. So it's not a fixed and unchangeable object. So much for a poet writing something which more or less has one author and then several scribes. What if we translate that into a field I'm more familiar with, early modern theatre? Now, we had one author who wrote a poem, which we don't have his own copy of, but we have copies from people who worked closely with him, we think. But early modern theatre is a different thing entirely. The whole thing is co-created, co-constructed. Every time there's a performance, it changes. When an audience laughs at something, you put maybe more of that or maybe less of that joke into the next scene. Let's take Shakespeare, because that was the project I was working on at the time, a project on the first folio. He was part of the troupe of actors. He was writing for his friends. This is William Kemp, who famously is Morris dancing from London to Norwich, because why wouldn't you if you could? So he's writing parts for the people that he knows. So the imagination of those people, his friends, are part of his construction. And then we have many, many steps, which I could dwell on at length and won't, because time presses. Before we get to any of the versions that are extant now, we have nothing in, none of his plays in his handwriting. What we do have is a selection of early prints, some of them single plays in quarto format, and famously the folios, starting with the first folio, 1623. And this is the beginning of copyright, arguably. This is in the Stationers' Register, where the publishers, the consortium of publishers who published the first folio, this collection of 36 of Shakespeare's plays, this is where they recorded their license to print those 36 plays together. Now in 1623, when it was printed, a copy of it came to the library where I work, and was on shelf, open access shelving. It was called the Public Library at the time. We might dispute whether that term has changed at all. And it was on shelf right through the theatre closures under the Puritan, under the Puritans. It was read to death pretty much, and now is not accessible to readers because it's in such a fragile state. So we raised money to digitise it, which we did, and put it online. It is, we would say, a scholarly social machine in itself. Its research interest is not because it's the first folio, because there are many copies. It's one of the most common surviving books from that period. The interest is in the individual copy. You can tell things about its manufacturing process and also about how it was received. Here are some interesting organic stains with an apple pip squashed in the gutter that we discovered when we went through it, and someone bouncing a knife or a needle or something up and down on the top margins. So it's the materiality of this thing that makes it interesting. Even though there's a full text online, it's a full text of that material thing. That's the point. So, with Dave DeRoy, we came up with this idea of what a scholarly social machine might be, performed and generative and collaborative, and the whole thing is a social machine, from the construction of the plays through to its performance and on to the editions that we get today. We thought there might be a better way of describing their connection than this sort of machine, although it is a great way of linking texts. So we tried prov as a way of describing some of these connections, and it was trickier than we thought, mostly because it looked like this. Now, I was lucky enough to be working with Dave DeRoy, who did the programming of it, so I didn't have to do it, which is a relief to me. these are some of the points we wanted to capture: its plurality, the difficulty of describing its physical state and then its analogue. And these were some of the things in particular which were interested in discussing further with the people who know a lot about prov. The ambiguities of it, how do you express uncertainty and give credit to the people, because what is now commonly known was someone's lifetime of research. And this, I think, is where the internet, thank you, Vint, can help us. Here is, because we haven't had enough great white men, this is my attempt at diversity. He's Italian. This is Dante writing in Paradiso, that within its depths I saw gathered together, bound by love. I love this. Bound by love, or the semantic web, whatever you like, into a single volume, leaves that lie scattered through the universe. That to me is what we can do. We need help doing it. We need help with the tooling. We need help to understand prov and how we can apply it better. I have so many people to thank. This is it takes a village to raise a digital project. Here are some of them. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions, please. Last questions before coffee break.
Well, that's a way of saying no questions.
You're not leaving before time. That was great.
Of the myriad of things that were difficult with using prov, what was like the really hard thing to do?
So we found some things hard and then discussed further with Graham Klein, one of our colleagues who was also part of the team that developed it, and he thought that they weren't.
That's his ground.
He has such a fine mind. It's brilliant talking to him. I think it was the multiplicity, because the way to make it work properly in prov would be to say that once it gets to a compositor, to a printer, to someone making the physical things, for every imprint, that could be different. So you need a different sort of instantiation of the first folio. Now that's possible to say that. We posit that there were maybe 750 or 800 copies. We don't know. It's people's best guess. But even if you had the time and can make anything usable out of saying, and here are 800, of which we have maybe 200 and some of them are partial, and some, before you get onto that, you're already saying we're guessing we're about 800. So it's to go out from that and then back in to, and here's one of them, which we digitised. And here's the text we made of it, and where that text is missing and damaged, we've taken, we've supplied the text that we got from this one. So it's the multiplicity, and for me the uncertainty, because computers like things in numbers, and I'm not 80% certain about this, I'm not 79%, I don't know, it's just, most people think this, or here's a group of scholars who think this, and in order to make it work well, you not only need to have tools around it to make it usable by people like me, but you also need it to be vast and all-encompassing, so that it can go out in all directions and you can see what else these printers printed, and which scholars who think that there were only 250 copies ever made also think, do you see what I mean? It's those endless linkings. Hello Dave, you're going to have a more intelligent response.
I made the converse point that that's what was tricky about prov, but actually what went really well, interestingly, was the fact that we used it to describe something that's transitioning from a digital, an analog world into digital. I thought it was going to work. I thought I was going to come back to you and Luke and say, all your examples of digital, we tried it on something analog, it didn't work. It did. You secretly made it work for the real world as opposed to the digital world. Well done, guys.
It is amazing, and we presented this at a conference that we organised with the Folger Shakespeare Library in July, which was in Oxford, called Digitising the Stage, Rethinking the Early Modern Theatre Archive, and it was a room full of editors and actors and directors and so on, and they were really interested in it, but they're not interested in the way it looks now.
Yeah, no.
So it's an idea that has some currency.
Maybe we should convert it into text.
Hey, we could write a book about that, couldn't we? Yeah. Great idea.
Thank you very, very much. So we'll be breaking for coffee for half an hour, but I just wanted to quickly express my gratitude for this particular congregation, this particular time, because to me it feels like the mix of social perspectives, cognitive perspectives, and the infrastructure that we need to develop to deliver the social systems with the cognitive models and the tools is really coming together. So I'm very grateful, and I look forward to the next set of speakers in half an hour. Let's have some more chocolate, please.